Travels of the Ellis Arbor is a TTRPG story set in the world of Bastion using the Vagrant Sun campaign setting. Tune in for episode 32, Marvellous. Heavy were the thoughts of Captain Darian as he fell asleep that night. Dreams of a soothing and enchanting voice racking his brain and his nerves with visceral contempt. Fortunately, none of the crew had witnessed his fateful encounter with the Lady of Blood. He could stay their worries about his intent for perhaps a time longer. Taking to the road once again, they were barely under a day's travel to their nearest destination. The Pelongi Plains were host to a number of towns nestled within the foothills of the Cobalite Keeps. The mountain ranges of Far Reach could be seen from every corner of the continent, but the villages of the Pelongi Plains had perhaps the best and most enchanting view. A reliable informant had given them simple understanding of the options that lay before them. Putzercourt, a town of red roses and transmutative wizards, was quiet and contemplative. But a poor choice if someone were trying to slip through unnoticed. Nout would have not sheltered here. So heading east along the road, one might venture into the walls of Mizeldorf. Tall, magnificent sunflowers adorned every pathway and rooftop. Darian was certain that Nout wouldn't dare to venture within these walls. Nout, as he was ashamed to admit, suffered from a variety of pollen-borne allergies. Further east, and almost at the very southern tip of the Cobalite Keeps, lay Tortu. Perhaps the most elegant of towns, it was host to a variety of lotus blooms and home to the guilds of alchemists and potion makers. Though, despite Nout's predisposition for alchemy, Darian knew only too well that Nout was clever enough not to fall into his own habits. No, it must be the final town of the village menagerie that the party should begin their search. As they crested into view of the foothills, Edward and Moore cooed in wonderment. Denea's Mere, a town of soft blue cornflowers, and a mill that stood taller than all the other buildings of the plains. It was the closest village to the Great Eastern Roads, and Darian was assured that this way station would be the perfect place for a number of their required activities. Firstly, they needed supplies. Both Darian and Edward were spent, having made do with little to no rations and a dwindling supply of black powder and ammunition. Together with his Myconid companion, Edward waltzed into town with a sack full of gold, hoping to fashion a generous supply of food and wares. Carpathian and Darian followed the paths to the very eastern edge of town, where the trade centers and guild masters were based. Second, they needed information. Lay of the land and a keen understanding of marketplace politics was one thing, but they needed to understand what vestiges and hideaways Nout may have opted for. Passing a few gold under the table, Darian learned of a particular courier working out of the Jew Downs restocking facility. Though it was essentially an armory and barracks for the Meladonian Guard, the officials were more than happy to make some extra coin to sell their trade secrets. And finally, they needed a point of origin. Leaving Carpathian to assess their information repository, Darian headed for the local millworks and an assortment of taverns and bars. There, they would be able to find soft beds and a comfortable room from which to begin their search for Nout. Lying before him, a tall, slim building with a corner suite and a quaint shop front, lay a tavern called the Humsworthy Domicile. It appeared little more than a room and board, but the blue-painted windowsills and clean glass front doors led Darian to believe that this may be of some repute. Stepping in through the open doors, a fragrant, blossoming scent hit his nose. the soft, verdant aroma of well-kept gardens, the warm, inviting light of a busy kitchen, and the delightful array of wines precariously adorning makeshift shelves behind a modest bar. Pointing toward what appeared to be a mid-range vermouth, he drew a glass from a free table and handed the barman 2 silver, beginning the process of removing his mud-caked and road-worn boots. In perhaps the last 2 months, Darian had only been able to take a few quiet moments to himself. Even the quiet bars of the Hemvala parish and the briny ward commons bore onlookers and nosy types that would scarcely leave him be, as well as his wily band. This quiet, homely shop may just be the respite he needed to get his thoughts in order and his mind attuned. Darian rarely smoked. He kept a pipe in his pocket on occasions, but had unsuccessfully acquired the habit. Fumbling in his pockets to draw his miniature ship free, his fingers grazed across the polished black handle of the pipe he'd acquired amidst his travels. And chuckling to himself, he drew it free and fumbled in his pouch for what resembled tobacco. A little damp and perhaps not even usable, but a handful of leaves that wormed their way into the bottom corners. He drew them forth, curved them into a small, roughly shaped bird's nest, and proceeded to prepare his pipe. In the comforting practice of pouring a glass of wine and preparing a smoking pipe, Darian found his center once more. Rapid thoughts and fiery emotions still plagued his mind, but setting into his captain-like traditions returned pleasant and distant memories to him. Thoughts of being on the sea, adorned with his captain's cloak, and the soft crackle of candlelight within his chambers, and the wood of the Ellis Arbor beneath his feet. But sadly, he was struck by a sudden and unfortunate thought. Though he was able to conjure enough pipeweed for a single draw, he was without another crucial ingredient: matches. Edward and Moore were well out of earshot, and he'd not thought to ask for such basic supplies. But before he could grumble under his breath and return the pipe to his pocket, Darian was startled by a faint and striking light that caught his eye. Leaning over the table in front of him, a heavily obscured figure leaned forward with a freshly struck match. A wiry frame and swathed in what appeared to be a bespoke long jacket. The figure pulled his hood back just far enough to see his eyes. A dark brown with sharp, angular features. He kept a cover over his mouth and nose, but the silhouette that was revealed seemed honest enough. "Here, friend. The first one is free. Can't let another traveler be without their vices." Composing himself, Darian leaned forward, took the match from the figure, and lit the damp leaves within his pipe. He coughed a few times, but let the warm vapor of his pipe fill his nostrils and warm his throat. Darian simply nodded and turned away to his own table. But the figure was insistent on his reply. "I couldn't help but notice you and your friends are new to this town. We'd heard tell of a band of 4 monster slayers that might be wandering through. You've certainly made a reputation for yourselves through merchant talks." Darian put his pipe to the side, startled by the response. "You think so? I'd like to think that plenty of travelers are equipped enough to deal with the threats between here and Melodona. Nobody should walk those paths except with experienced warriors. It'd be a fool's errand." And yet, fools continue to take the Hemvala paths. Just like their choice of career, merchants rely a little too heavily on luck. The unlucky simply get rich enough to not have to take the paths. There's not much else to it. Unsure of what to say, Darian simply reached for his wine, locking eyes with the individual all the while. Of course, traveling with a mic in it is much more a distinct giveaway, I'd say. Darian chuckled. That makes sense. I guess we're not entirely about keeping to ourselves. Speaking of, surely you're not here for simple and polite conversation. Even from beneath the layers of cloth, Darian could see that the figure's face had turned into a sly grin. Ah, I see you're as perceptive as I imagined. You know, there's plenty of work for people like you and I. Lots of gold to be made from protecting merchants, sentinel duties, and monster slaying. You know, adventurer kind of work. There was a pause. Darian waited for him to finish his sentence, but it never came. The brown eyes glanced over his weapon and back to his own. And I presume you have a bequest? Oh, no. Quite the opposite, actually. You see, my colleagues and I have a little monopoly on that kind of work here. Running somewhat of a delicate operation. It's quite the task, you see, keeping the streets safe and the roads clear. It would be disappointing if something were to upset the internal balance. Perhaps it's best that you don't get involved. Darian chuckled, this time with an air of blatant patronization. Don't you worry, my friend. We're simply passing through on other business. I wouldn't dream of taking your line of work from you. That would be callous and cruel. Especially if you have a good thing going here. I can respect a business mindset. Well, thank you for the match. The grin from behind the mask fell into a pursed lip, and the tone shifted almost instantly. How very generous of you. Well, so long as you don't mind keeping well out of my business mindset, we've no problems. That would be simply marvelous. And as the figure turned to leave, his long black coat flew behind him. The venomous reply was punctuated only by a flash of black and white checks that caught Darian's watchful eyes. Travels of the Ellis Arbor is made possible by the generous support of our subscribers, our followers, and most notably, our patrons. Thanks to all our Moon, Wedge, Crown, and Hex tier patrons for supporting us so far on this journey. Please subscribe, give a like or a comment, follow us on Twitter, and stay tuned for the next episode. Make sure you follow us here on YouTube, on Spotify, and on twitch.tv/lonomy. Don't forget, take care of each other.